Most people picture the world of early Christianity as a religious story: parables and prophets, faith and salvation, spiritual struggles in an ancient holy land. But for the people actually living there, survival was not about belief. It was about grain, land, and silver. More specifically, about who controlled them. The region where Jesus lived and died was caught inside one of history's most efficient wealth extraction systems. In the first century, Judea existed as a province within the Roman Empire, a machine built to move resources from the periphery to the core. Rome didn't conquer to civilize, it conquered to extract. Every province had one primary function: generate surplus that could be shipped to Rome. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, timber from Gaul. Judea provided taxes, tribute, and agricultural output, and it had no choice in the matter. This mattered because Judea was economically fragile. The land was not particularly fertile. Water was scarce. Most families survived on small agricultural plots that produced just enough in good years. There was no cushion. A drought, a pest infestation, or a disrupted planting season meant genuine hunger, and the empire did not adjust its demands based on local conditions. Rome governed through proxies. Client kings like Herod the Great maintained order with Roman backing. After Herod's death, Roman prefects, such as Pontius Pilate, ruled directly. Their mandate was not welfare, it was stability and revenue extraction. Keep the province quiet, keep the money flowing. Nothing else mattered. The tax system was the mechanism of extraction, and unlike modern taxation, which theoretically scales with ability to pay, taxes in Roman Judea were fixed obligations. You owed them whether you had a good harvest or lost everything. Land tax, poll tax, customs duties, tolls on trade routes. Each was enforced ruthlessly. There were no exemptions for hardship. There was no grace period. There was only payment or consequences. Tax collection was privatized. Rome auctioned off the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. These tax farmers paid Rome up front and then squeezed the population to recoup their investment and turn a profit. The system incentivized abuse. Overcharging wasn't corruption, it was the business model. Resistance was met with violence. Soldiers backed the collectors. Debt spiraled quickly. And debt was the trap. When families couldn't pay, they borrowed. But ancient debt had none of the protections modern borrowers expect. No interest rate caps, no bankruptcy process, no legal recourse. Loans came from wealthy landowners, merchants, or temple officials. Interest accumulated rapidly. Land served as collateral. One bad season could trigger a cascade that destroyed a family for generations. The pattern was predictable. A farmer plants. Weather fails. Harvest disappoints. Taxes remain due. The farmer borrows at high interest. Next year's harvest goes to the lender. Debt compounds. Eventually, the land is foreclosed. The farmer becomes a tenant on his own former property, or a day laborer, or disappears into the margins entirely. This was not accidental. The system concentrated wealth systematically. Small plots consolidated into large estates. Land accumulated in the hands of elites connected to Roman authority and temple administration. The majority fell into dependency. Economic mobility was not downward, it was eliminated, and there was no safety net. Lose your land and you lost everything. No public assistance, no social programs, no unemployment support. Extended family networks provided some buffer, but they could only absorb so much. When multiple families collapsed simultaneously, there was nothing. You survived on charity if you were lucky. If not, you didn't survive. Debt carried social weight beyond the financial. It meant losing your place in the community. It meant your children inherited obligation instead of opportunity. It meant shame. The system didn't just create poverty, it embedded it into identity. This is the context, this is what shaped daily existence, and it's critical to understand. People were not poor because they lacked virtue or discipline or faith. They were poor because the economic structure required their poverty to function. Rome needed tribute. Local elites needed rents. Temple operations needed revenue. All of that pressure landed on people with no margin for error. This generated constant tension. Judea was not peaceful. It simmered with resentment and periodic violence. Banditry was rampant, not as crime, but as survival. Rebel movements emerged regularly, promising justice, liberation, reversal of fortunes. Messianic expectation was not abstract theology. It was economic desperation, seeking a solution. And this is what modern audiences often fail to grasp. When people in Judea heard teachings about debt forgiveness, jubilee, and reversal, they were not hearing metaphors. They were hearing literal economic relief. When the poor were centered in a message, it wasn't distant charity. It was their own lives. Forgiveness didn't just mean spiritual absolution. It meant debt cancellation. It meant escape from the trap. Escape was almost impossible under Roman rule. The system was designed for efficiency, not mercy. It extracted consistently and tolerated suffering as long as order held. Stability mattered more than justice. Revenue mattered more than lives. This is why the region felt suffocating. People worked harder and fell further behind. Effort didn't guarantee security. Growth benefited those at the top and crushed everyone else. Crucially, no one was under any illusion. There was no belief that the system was fair. There was no expectation that hard work would be rewarded. There was only endurance, anger, and hope that something might break the cycle. That hope is dangerous to any system, because when extraction is this total, even small disruptions feel revolutionary. Even words can threaten stability. By the time Jesus began his public activity, economic conditions were already at a breaking point. The audience was ready. The fractures were visible. The rage was rational. The desperation was grounded in material reality. This is not background. This is the catalyst. To understand why the system felt so inescapable, you need to understand the one institution everyone expected to offer protection, the temple in Jerusalem. Today, people imagine it as purely religious, a place of worship, sacrifice, and spiritual authority. But economically, the temple was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It didn't just mediate belief, it moved enormous amounts of wealth. The temple operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Spiritually, it was sacred, the dwelling place of God's presence on earth. Economically, it functioned as a treasury, a lending institution, a tax authority, and a legal court. These roles were not separate. They reinforced each other. Every adult Jewish male owed an annual temple tax. This was mandatory. It was not symbolic. It was enforced as strictly as any Roman tax. The tax had to be paid in a specific currency, the Tyrian shekel, which had consistent silver content. Local coins were not accepted. Roman currency was not accepted. This created a forced exchange market. Money changers operated at the temple to facilitate this. They charged fees. Pilgrims traveling from distant regions had to convert their money just to fulfill their religious obligation. Animal vendors sold offerings, doves for the poor, lambs and cattle for the wealthy at temple-approved prices. If you were poor, you paid less, but you still paid. The system was inescapable. Religious obligation did not replace the Roman tax burden. It was added to it, and here is the tension that mattered. The temple elite were deeply embedded with Roman power. High priests were not chosen by the community or by spiritual criteria. They were appointed with Roman approval. They served at Rome's pleasure. Stability was the priority. Cooperation was expected. So the institution that claimed to represent God's justice operated within the same extraction logic that immiserated the population. The temple preached holiness, righteousness, and mercy, but its financial operations reinforced debt, inequality, and exclusion. Access to the sacred required payment. Purity required offerings. Atonement required sacrifice. Sacrifice required money. If you had none, you depended on charity. Charity could not absorb systemic pressure. People noticed the contradiction. By the first century, resentment toward temple authorities was widespread. Not because people rejected their faith, but because they saw the institution as complicit. The temple looked less like a mediator between God and humanity, and more like another mechanism of elite control. This context is essential because Jesus did not operate outside this system. He spoke directly into it. When he discussed debt forgiveness, people heard economic terms. When he mentioned release, they understood material relief. When he elevated the poor, they did not imagine abstract charity. They saw themselves. When he spoke of the kingdom of God, they did not hear distant theology. They heard an alternative order where the current system was not final. Words alone do not threaten empires. Actions do. Jesus did not attack Rome directly. That would have been suicidal. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed values. He challenged who deserved authority and why. He spoke in ways that weakened the moral foundation that justified both Roman extraction and temple complicity. Economic language saturates the teachings. Debt, laborers, wages, vineyards, stewards, masters, servants, creditors. These were not random metaphors. They reflected lived experience. They made invisible structures visible. They named the system. And then came the act that escalated everything, the temple disruption. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out the vendors, this was not simply religious anger, it was economic confrontation. He was not attacking prayer or sacrifice. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to God. He called it a den of robbers, not because commerce existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated many things. It tolerated preachers. It tolerated critics. It tolerated local religious disputes. What it did not tolerate was instability. And temple authorities understood that unrest during Passover, when Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims, was extremely dangerous. Large crowds plus economic grievance equaled rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus was not just teaching. He was disrupting revenue flows. He was questioning legitimacy. He was destabilizing the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. This is the crucial insight. The conflict was not primarily theological. It was economic and political. The system could absorb suffering. It could absorb inequality. What it could not absorb was a narrative that questioned why suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Because once people stop accepting debt as fate, extraction becomes harder to enforce. Once people question whether the system serves justice, compliance weakens. Once legitimacy erodes, force alone cannot maintain order indefinitely. By this point, Judea was a powder keg. Taxes, land loss, debt, religious obligation, political repression all converged. Revolt was inevitable. Rome responded the only way it knew how, overwhelming violence. What came after Jesus was not systemic reform. It was escalation. Within a generation, Judea exploded into open war. In 66 CE, full-scale rebellion erupted. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was besieged. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish life, was destroyed completely. Its treasury was looted. Its priesthood was eliminated. Hundreds of thousands died or were enslaved. Rome did not just suppress dissent. It dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible. And then Rome rebuilt control on its own terms. The destruction of the temple did not end extraction. It streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. Debt did not vanish. It became more bureaucratic, more absolute, less visible. The old moral framework collapsed, but material pressure intensified. In the immediate term, Rome won decisively. But controlling territory is not the same as controlling meaning. Jesus had not led an army. He had not proposed new tax policy or land redistribution. He was not trying to replace Roman administration with an alternative state. And that is exactly why his impact cannot be measured by military or political outcomes. What he challenged was not Rome's capacity to extract. It was the moral logic that made extraction seem inevitable, natural, and divinely ordained. By questioning whether debt reflected moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional payment structures, by centering the poor rather than treating them as defective, Jesus destabilized something Rome depended on as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, the system Jesus critiqued did not disappear, but neither did the critique. In the decades that followed, small communities formed operating on different principles: shared resources, mutual aid, debt relief within the group, membership based on belief rather than land, ethnicity, or status. These were not political revolutions. They were parallel logics, ways of organizing life inside the empire without fully submitting to its moral economy. Rome crushed armed rebellions quickly and efficiently, but this kind of challenge was harder to eliminate because it required no territory, no temples, no treasuries. It traveled with people, it functioned under pressure, it survived loss. And over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully recaptured control of the narrative people told about power, debt, and justice. By the 4th century, the empire did not eliminate this alternative framework. It absorbed it. In doing so, it quietly conceded something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered even to imperial power. The economy of 1st century Judea reveals something uncomfortable. Systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction to an extraordinary degree, but it never fully repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel natural and necessary. And that is the deeper lesson. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are extraordinarily durable. They survive hardship, they survive resentment, they even survive armed rebellion. What they do not survive is widespread disbelief, the moment when people stop accepting that their suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History does not repeat exactly, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with soldiers, but with stories, it becomes much harder to believe those stories are accidental or neutral. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.